She had 9 children. 3 died before her. One followed her to the grave within 7 months. Another burned 30 years of history, page by page, destroying her mother's most intimate secrets forever. One son shot himself at his parents' anniversary party. One daughter kissed her dying child and caught the disease that killed them both on the exact anniversary of her father's death, 17 years to the day. And one grandson would use the hemophilia she passed through her blood to help destroy an empire, leading to 7 bodies in a Russian basement. This is what happened to Queen Victoria's 9 children after she died, and why the grandmother of Europe became the ancestor of its greatest catastrophe. It is 6:30 in the evening on January 22nd, 1901. At Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, the most powerful woman on earth takes her final breath. Queen Victoria lies in her canopied bed, surrounded by her children and grandchildren. Her eldest son, Bertie, holds her frail hand. Her grandson, Wilhelm, the German Kaiser, kneels at her side. Her favorite Pomeranian, Turi, rests on the bed beside her. The woman who ruled a quarter of the world's population for 63 years is gone. She was 81 years old. She had reigned longer than any British monarch before her. She had outlived 3 of her 9 children. She had seen her grandchildren ascend thrones across Europe, from Germany to Russia to Spain. She had shaped an entire era that bore her name. But the story of Victoria's children was only beginning its strangest and most tragic chapter. Within 7 months, her eldest daughter would follow her to the grave, dying of spinal cancer, while her son, the Kaiser, watched with cold satisfaction. Within 13 years, one grandson would lead millions to their deaths in the bloodiest war humanity had ever seen. Within 17 years, another grandson, the Tsar of Russia, would be executed in a basement along with his wife, his 5 children, and 4 servants, their bodies dissolved in acid and buried in unmarked graves. The disease Victoria carried in her blood, hemophilia, would play a direct role in the fall of the Russian Empire. Her youngest daughter would spend 3 decades systematically destroying her mother's legacy, burning 122 volumes of journals, deleting what she considered too revealing, sanitizing history itself. The grandmother of Europe had created a web of blood connections that would strangle the continent. Victoria had not always been the stern widow in black that the world came to know. She had been a passionate young queen who fell deeply in love with her cousin, Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. They married in February 1840 when she was just 20 years old. Over the next 17 years, she gave birth to 9 children: Vicky in 1840, Bertie in 1841, Alice in 1843, Alfred in 1844, Helena in 1846, Louise in 1848, Arthur in 1850, Leopold in 1853, and finally, Beatrice in 1857. 5 daughters and 4 sons, who would grow up in the glittering world of Buckingham Palace, Windsor Castle, Balmoral, and Osborne House. Prince Albert designed an education system for his children that was demanding and comprehensive. Languages, history, science, philosophy, art. He was determined that his children would be prepared to rule, to influence, to lead. Victoria's role was different. She was the queen first and a mother second. In her private journals, she confessed that she found babies frog-like and unappealing. She resented the pregnancies that kept her from her duties. She compared being pregnant to feeling like a cow or a dog. But as her children grew, Victoria developed complicated, often suffocating relationships with each of them. Vicky, the eldest daughter, was her father's favorite, a brilliant and intellectually curious girl who could speak English, French, and German fluently by age 3. She would marry the future German emperor and spend her life trying to liberalize Prussia, only to watch her own son, Kaiser Wilhelm II, reject everything she stood for. Bertie, the Prince of Wales, was a constant disappointment to both parents. He struggled with his studies and showed more interest in pleasure than in preparation for kingship. Victoria once called him my caricature. She blamed him for his father's death and could barely look at him without shuddering. Alice was gentle and compassionate, the natural nurse who would lose her 2-year-old son to hemophilia, then die herself on the exact anniversary of her father's death after kissing her dying child. Alfred, nicknamed Affy, was mischievous and drawn to the sea. He would become the only member of the royal family to survive an assassination attempt in Australia, then watch his only son shoot himself at a family party. Helena was practical and devoted, though never considered pretty. She would spend 57 years in marriage to a man 15 years her senior and outlive most of her siblings. Louise was the beauty and the rebel, the sculptor who refused to marry a foreign prince and instead chose a British nobleman, scandalizing the family. Arthur was his mother's favourite, a natural soldier who would live to be 91 and serve as a living link between the Victorian era and World War II. Leopold was fragile and ill, suffering from hemophilia that made every fall potentially deadly. He would die at 30 from a minor slip on the stairs, and Beatrice, the baby, was kept prisoner by her mother's possessiveness, forbidden from even discussing marriage until she was nearly 30. She would spend 3 decades after Victoria's death systematically destroying her mother's true voice. On December 14th, 1861, everything changed. Prince Albert died of typhoid fever at just 42 years old. Victoria was devastated beyond measure. She withdrew from public life and wrapped herself in mourning that would last the remaining 40 years of her life. She slept with Albert's nightshirt beside her. She had his clothes laid out fresh each morning as if he might return. She clung to her children, especially her daughters, with a possessiveness that would shape and distort their entire lives. She blamed Bertie for his father's death. Albert had travelled to Cambridge to confront his son over an affair with an actress named Nellie Clifton. He returned exhausted and fell ill shortly after. Victoria wrote that she could never look at her eldest son without a shudder. She would hold this grudge for decades. For her daughters, Victoria had a grand plan. She would use them as pawns in the great game of European politics. She would marry them to princes and kings, and through their wombs, her blood would flow into every royal house on the continent. She called herself the grandmother of Europe, and she meant it literally. The first to go was Vicky, married at 17 to the future German Kaiser, then Alice, married to the Grand Duke of Hesse in a ceremony Victoria called more like a funeral than a wedding. Helena married a German prince 15 years her senior. Louise, in a shocking break with tradition, married a British nobleman. Only Beatrice was kept close, forbidden from even discussing marriage until she was nearly 30. By the time Victoria died in 1901, her children had scattered across Europe. Her grandchildren sat on thrones in Germany, Russia, Greece, Romania, Spain, and Norway. But her family was also a tangle of rivalries, resentments, and inherited diseases that would have catastrophic consequences for millions. Princess Alice was the first child Victoria lost, and her death reads like Greek tragedy. Alice had been the most nurturing of Victoria's daughters, the one who nursed her dying father through his final illness when she was just 17 years old. She held his hand as he slipped away. She comforted her hysterical mother. She became the unofficial secretary to the grieving queen. Alice married Louis of Hesse in July 1862 at Osborne House. Victoria watched from an armchair dressed in black, weeping throughout the ceremony. The guests wore subdued mourning colours. Alice herself had to change into mourning dress immediately after the service. It was hardly the wedding a princess deserved. Alice settled in Darmstadt, Germany, where money was always tight. The Grand Duchy was small and poor compared to the British court she had left behind, but Alice worked tirelessly to improve conditions for the sick and wounded. She established hospitals, trained nurses, became friends with Florence Nightingale. But Alice also carried a deadly secret in her blood: hemophilia. Her young son Friedrich, called Fritti, was diagnosed when he bled for 3 days after cutting his ear. In May 1873, 2-year-old Fritti was playing in his mother's bedroom. He climbed onto a chair by the window. He fell 20 feet to the terrace below. For any other child, the fall might have caused bruises and broken bones. For Fritty, it caused unstoppable bleeding in his brain. He died hours later in his mother's arms. Alice never fully recovered from the loss. Then, in November 1878, diphtheria swept through Alice's household. Her eldest daughter, Victoria, fell ill on November 5th. Within days, the disease spread to Alex, Marie, Irene, and Ernst. Her husband, Louis, caught it too. Alice nursed them all, moving from bedside to bedside, monitoring fevers, administering medicine, trying desperately to save her family. Her youngest daughter, Marie, just 4 years old, grew weaker and weaker. On November 16th, Marie died. Alice arrived at her bedside too late. Alice kept the news of Marie's death secret from her other children for weeks as they fought for their own lives. When she finally told her son, Ernst Ludwig, in early December, he collapsed in grief, refusing to believe his baby sister was gone. Alice broke the strict rule against touching the infected. She embraced her son. She kissed him. Within days, Alice developed diphtheria herself. On December 14th, 1878, exactly 17 years to the day after her father's death, she slipped into unconsciousness. Her last words were a whisper, "Dear Papa." She died just after 8:30 in the morning. She was 35 years old. Victoria was shattered by the news. 2 deaths on the same day, 17 years apart. She called it almost incredible and most mysterious. The timing seemed too perfect, too deliberate, as if fate itself was writing the script. Prince Leopold was the next to die, and his death revealed the true curse Victoria had passed to her children. Leopold had hemophilia, the first of Victoria's children to actually suffer from the disease rather than merely carry it. His childhood was a constant battle against his mother's overprotection. She wanted him home, safe, wrapped in cotton. He wanted to live. From his earliest years, Leopold had doctors in permanent attendance. Every cut, every bruise, every tumble that other children shrugged off could kill him. Victoria placed endless restrictions on his activities. She forbade him from playing with his brothers. She kept him isolated. Leopold chafed against these chains, yet he remained the most intellectual of Victoria's sons. He had his father's love of learning and the arts. He fought for the right to attend Oxford University and won. He studied at Christ Church, became president of the Oxford University Chess Club, befriended Alice Liddell, the young woman who had inspired Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland. Some whispered of a romance between them. Leopold also suffered from epilepsy, which at the time was considered even more shameful than hemophilia. This made finding a bride extremely difficult. Several princesses rejected him. Finally, with help from his mother and eldest sister, Leopold met Princess Helena of Waldeck and Pyrmont. They married in April 1882. Leopold was ecstatic. Marriage meant independence from his suffocating mother. They had a daughter, Alice, in 1883. His wife was pregnant with their second child when Leopold travelled to Cannes in February 1884. His joints ached constantly, a common symptom of hemophilia, and the cold English winter made it worse. On March 27th, at his Cannes residence, Villa Nevada, Leopold slipped and fell on the stairs. He injured his knee and hit his head. For anyone else, it would have been a minor accident. For a hemophiliac, it was a death sentence. He died in the early hours of March 28th from bleeding in his brain. He was 30 years old. 4 months later, his widow gave birth to a son, Charles Edward. This child grew up to become a Nazi sympathizer who fought against Britain in World War I and was stripped of all his British titles. Prince Alfred died just 6 months before his mother, and his death was preceded by a family tragedy so shocking that it was covered up for decades. Affi had been the adventurous one, the sailor prince who joined the Royal Navy at 14 and became the first member of the royal family to circumnavigate the globe. In 1868, during a visit to Sydney, an assassin shot Alfred in the back during a charity picnic. He survived only because nurses trained by Florence Nightingale knew how to treat the wound. Alfred married Grand Duchess Maria Alexandrovna of Russia in 1874. She was proud, cold, and fiercely conscious of her imperial heritage. The marriage was not happy. Alfred drank heavily and kept company with courtesans across Europe. In 1893, Alfred inherited the German duchy of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. His only son, also named Alfred and called young Affi, was a troubled young man. He contracted syphilis during his military service and fell into depression. His mother tried to arrange a marriage, but the engagement was called off. Young Affi grew increasingly unstable. At his parents' 25th wedding anniversary celebration at Schloss Friedenstein in Gotha on January 23, 1899, young Affi shot himself with a revolver. He did not die immediately. His parents, horrified and humiliated, sent him to a sanatorium in Austria. The official story was that he was recovering from nervous depression. 2 weeks later, on February 6, 1899, he died. He was 24 years old. The official cause was listed as chronic cerebral affection. The truth, suicide, was hidden for decades. Alfred was devastated. His relationship with his wife collapsed completely. Some said he never slept under the same roof as her again. He turned to alcohol more heavily than before and developed throat cancer. On July 30, 1900, he died at a hunting lodge near Schloss Rosenau. He was 55. Victoria had lost her third child just 6 months before her own death. When Victoria died in January 1901, 6 children survived her. One of them would follow her to the grave within 7 months. Vicky, the Princess Royal, had been dying slowly for years. She was diagnosed with breast cancer in late 1898. By 1900, the cancer had spread to her spine. She was in constant agony, unable to sleep, barely able to eat. Vicky's life in Germany had been difficult from the start. She arrived as a 17-year-old bride full of liberal ideals and dreams of reforming Prussia. Her father had groomed her for this mission. She would bring British constitutional principles to the German states and help create a unified liberal Germany. Instead, she found herself in a militaristic conservative court that viewed her with suspicion and hostility. Chancellor Otto von Bismarck became her implacable enemy. The conservative press attacked her as the English woman. Her letters to her mother were intercepted and read by Prussian intelligence. Her husband Frederick shared her liberal views. They dreamed of creating a constitutional monarchy. But Frederick's father, Wilhelm I, was robust and long-lived. He reigned until he was 90 years old. By the time Frederick finally became Kaiser in March 1888, he was already dying of throat cancer. He could barely speak. He communicated through written notes. Frederick reigned for just 99 days before dying on June 15th. Vicky was empress for barely 3 months. Everything they had hoped to accomplish died with him. Their eldest son, Wilhelm, became Kaiser Wilhelm II, and Wilhelm despised his mother. The birth had been traumatic, a breech delivery that went catastrophically wrong. The doctors, too modest to examine the princess properly, failed to detect the baby's position until it was too late. They had to use forceps to extract the infant. Baby Wilhelm's left arm was permanently damaged, withered and weak his entire life. Vicky blamed herself. Wilhelm blamed her too. He grew up resenting his disability and everything his mother represented. After Frederick's death, Wilhelm moved quickly to consolidate power. He sent soldiers to surround his mother's palace. He ordered her papers searched. He wanted to find and destroy any correspondence that might embarrass him. Vicky managed to smuggle her most sensitive letters out of the country, terrified that her son would destroy the evidence of her life's work. When Victoria died, Vicky was too ill to travel to England for the funeral. Her brother Bertie, now King Edward VII, came to visit her in February 1901. She gave him the letters she had smuggled out years before, entrusting him with the truth about her life in Germany. On August 5, 1901, less than 7 months after her mother, Vicky died. She was 60 years old. The correspondence between Vicky and Victoria survives today, nearly 8,000 letters documenting the most intimate relationship between any of Victoria's children and their mother. Bertie, the Prince of Wales, became King Edward VII the moment his mother died. He was 59 years old. He had waited longer for the throne than any heir in British history up to that point. He had spent decades being excluded from any real power by a mother who never forgave him for his father's death. Victoria had given Bertie almost nothing to do. She refused to share state papers with him. She denied him any meaningful role in government. So Bertie found other ways to occupy himself. He became the leader of fashionable society. He raced horses, gambled, ate enormous meals, had affairs with actresses and aristocrats. His appetites were legendary. But Edward was also a skilled diplomat, with an easy charm that his mother had lacked. He worked to improve relations between Britain and France at a time when the two countries were rivals. He helped lay the groundwork for the Entente Cordiale that would prove crucial in World War I. Edward modernized the British court. He ended some of Victoria's more oppressive mourning rituals. He brought warmth and colour back to public ceremonies. The Edwardian era became synonymous with elegance and pleasure. Edward reigned for just 9 years. His health was never good. He smoked constantly, 20 cigarettes and 12 cigars a day. He was overweight. In the spring of 1910, he developed bronchitis and refused to slow down. On May 6th, he collapsed after being told his horse had won at Kempton Park. He died that evening saying, "I shall not give in. I shall work to the end." He was 68 years old. His son George became King George V, the man who would lead Britain through the First World War and change the royal family's name from Saxe-Coburg and Gotha to Windsor, because the German name had become toxic. Helena outlived most of her siblings, quietly and diligently. She had married Prince Christian of Schleswig-Holstein in 1866, a match that caused a family crisis. Christian was 15 years older than Helena and considered a minor prince. But Helena and Christian settled near Victoria, and Helena became one of her mother's unofficial secretaries. She was never considered beautiful. One observer described her at 15 as chunky, dowdy, and double-chinned. She suffered from chronic pain and became dependent on opium. Helena threw herself into charitable work with dedication that few of her siblings matched. She became a founding member of the Red Cross, established the Royal School of Needlework, fought for the professional registration of nurses. Tragedy continued to visit her. Her infant son Harold died at just 8 days old in 1876. The following year, she gave birth to a stillborn son. Her eldest son, Christian Victor, died of malaria in South Africa during the Boer War in October 1900. Helena died on June 9, 1923, at age 77. She remains one of the most forgotten of Victoria's children. Louise was the rebel, the artist, the one who refused to follow the expected path. She trained as a sculptor and created the famous statue of Victoria that still stands outside Kensington Palace. Louise refused to marry a foreign prince. Instead, she chose John Campbell, Marquis of Lorne, heir to the Duke of Argyll. No British princess had married a subject since the 16th century. The marriage was unhappy. They drifted apart over the years. Rumours circulated that Lorne preferred the company of men. They had no children, possibly because of injuries Louise suffered during a severe sleigh accident in Canada in 1880. Louise was a quiet supporter of women's suffrage and women's education. After Lorne died in 1914, Louise spent her remaining decades at Kensington Palace. Her great-nieces, Princess Elizabeth and Princess Margaret, visited her often. Louise died on December 3, 1939, at age 91, with a debt of 15 shillings for cigarettes. She had lived through 6 reigns and seen the world transformed beyond recognition. Arthur was his mother's favourite child, and he knew it. Born on May 1, 1850, sharing his birthday with the Duke of Wellington, he showed a passion for military life from childhood. Arthur had a distinguished 40-year career in the British Army. He served in Canada, commanded at the Battle of Tel el-Kebir in Egypt, held the Bombay Command in India, rose to the rank of Field Marshal. In 1879, Arthur married Princess Louise Margaret of Prussia. They had 3 children. Through his daughter Margaret, who married the Crown Prince of Sweden, Arthur became the ancestor of the current kings of Sweden and Denmark. Arthur was appointed Governor-General of Canada in 1911, the only British prince ever to hold that position. He served through the first years of World War I. After returning to Britain, Arthur continued performing royal duties until his retirement in 1928. Even then, he maintained connections with the army well into World War II. He was present at the christening of the future Queen Elizabeth II, a living link between the Victorian era and the Elizabethan age to come. Arthur died on January 16, 1942, at Bagshot Park. He was 91 years old, Queen Victoria's last surviving son. Beatrice was the baby, and Queen Victoria intended to keep her that way forever. Beatrice was raised with the explicit understanding that she would never marry, never leave, never have a life of her own. She would be her mother's constant companion and secretary until death. Beatrice accepted this fate for most of her youth. She was shy and devoted, helping Victoria with correspondence, reading to her, keeping her company through endless years of black-clad widowhood. In 1884, at her brother Leopold's wedding, Beatrice met Prince Henry of Battenberg and fell in love. Victoria was enraged. She refused to speak to Beatrice for 7 months, communicating only through notes pushed across the dinner table. The household became unbearably tense. Finally, Victoria relented, but only on the condition that Henry would live with her and Beatrice would continue all her duties as secretary. Beatrice and Henry married in July 1885. They had 4 children. Their marriage was happy but short. In 1896, Henry volunteered to fight in the Fourth Anglo-Ashanti War. He contracted malaria in West Africa and died on January 20th. His body was preserved in rum and brought back to England. Beatrice was 38 years old and a widow. She devoted the rest of her life to her mother and her mother's legacy. After Victoria died, Beatrice was appointed the Queen's literary executor. Victoria had kept detailed journals since she was 13 years old, writing an average of 2,500 words a day for most of her life. The volumes numbered 122. Beatrice spent the next 30 years transcribing these journals in her own handwriting. And as she transcribed, she edited. She deleted passages she considered too personal or too revealing. She removed references to servants Victoria had loved. She excised political opinions that might prove controversial. She sanitized her mother's authentic voice. And when she finished copying each volume, she burned the original. The royal family watched helplessly. King George V and Queen Mary were powerless to stop her. Victoria had given Beatrice complete authority over the journals. The edited versions that survive are only 1/3 as long as the originals. We will never know what Victoria truly wrote about her children, her servants, her reign. Historians have lamented that Beatrice tore the tongue out of history's mouth. Beatrice's own children brought her both joy and sorrow. Her daughter Ina married King Alfonso XIII of Spain in 1906, bringing hemophilia into the Spanish royal family. The wedding was marred by an assassination attempt that killed bystanders. Her youngest son Maurice was killed in action during World War I in 1914. Her son Leopold died of complications from hip surgery. In her final years, Beatrice was crippled by arthritis and confined to a wheelchair. Beatrice died in her sleep on October 26, 1944, at age 87. She was Victoria's last surviving child. At Beatrice's funeral, an 18-year-old princess dressed in black stood in the choir stalls of St. George's Chapel. She watched as her great-great-aunt's coffin was lowered into the royal vault. Her name was Elizabeth. 8 years later, she would become Queen Elizabeth II. The descendants of Victoria's 9 children shaped the 20th century in ways their mother could never have imagined. Her grandson Wilhelm led Germany into World War I against his cousins George of Britain and Nicholas of Russia. All 3 monarchs were Victoria's grandchildren. All 3 had played together as children at her Jubilee celebrations. Nicholas and his family were murdered by Bolsheviks in 1918. The hemophilia that Victoria passed through her daughter Alice to her granddaughter Alexandra played a crucial role in their downfall. Alexandra's devotion to Rasputin, the mystic she believed could heal her hemophiliac son Alexei, helped destroy the Romanov dynasty. Rasputin's influence at court scandalized Russia and contributed to the revolution that swept the Romanovs from power. Victoria had wanted to unite Europe through her children's marriages. Instead, she created a web of competing loyalties that tore the continent apart. The grandmother of Europe became the ancestor of its greatest catastrophe. 3 of her grandchildren would wear crowns during World War I. They would send millions of their subjects to kill each other in trenches filled with mud and blood. The war killed 20 million people. It destroyed 4 empires. It set the stage for an even more devastating conflict just 2 decades later. The disease Victoria carried in her blood would spread through her descendants like a curse. Her daughter Alice passed it to her daughter Alexandra, who passed it to Tsarevich Alexei. Her daughter Beatrice passed it to her daughter Ina, who passed it to 2 sons who died young. Her son Leopold passed it to his daughter Alice, who passed it to her son Rupert, Viscount Tremerton, who died at 21 from a car accident that caused unstoppable bleeding. Today, Victoria's descendants sit on the thrones of the United Kingdom, Spain, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, and formerly on the thrones of Germany, Russia, Romania, and Greece. They are scattered across Europe and beyond, connected by blood that flows from one woman who died in 1901. The 9 children who stood around her deathbed would shape the century to come in ways both magnificent and terrible. They would build empires and watch them fall. They would forge alliances and break them. They would pass on diseases and titles and grudges that would ripple through generations.